Hello, my name's Laura, and I am privileged to be sharing with you today. So, you're going to watch a video where I talk about what is member care, what do we mean by that, how do we care for our sent ones well, why should we do that? And then looking at my research. So, I recently completed a master's with All Nations Christian College, and my dissertation was looking at how do we send people well. What care practices does that require? And looking at what practices are already in place in our churches and where are their gaps and how can we fill them. I personally have been sent by a local church and have gone as with New Frontiers, and I have experience of that personally, but I've also through the years made many friends who are in a similar position. And so I'm passionate about seeing us do this in a manner that honours God as part of our worship, that we go to the nations as part of our worship, but that we send as part of our worship. Thank you very much. So, my great passion and excitement is that God has a mission. He is on a mission and he is reconciling the earth to himself. But he's included us in that, which is actually mind blowing. In that, why would he choose to do that? But yet he has, and Jesus will receive the full reward for his suffering when he has around the throne a people from every tribe and every tongue and every nation. And we know the end of the story. Spoiler alert, we know that that will happen. Jesus has told us that will be the end result, but he's invited us into the adventure of drawing those people in. And I am convinced that this is a call for the whole church, not the few strange ones who are willing to move to other nations, but everybody, that if we are believers and followers of Jesus, we are caught up in this incredible call. And he's already talked about it, but in Matthew 28, the commission is to go to the ends of the earth. So, what does that look like? Does that mean that every follower of Christ needs to get on a plane? I want us to read, oh, I don't even have my phone, from Romans 10, verse 14 and 15. And this is often the kind of crux of mission teaching that Paul is saying. We'll read from 13. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That's his longing, that he reconciles all people with himself. But how then? How can they call on the one they've not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? That's the crux. If we're not willing to go and we're not willing to speak about Jesus, how will people ever hear? But Paul doesn't stop there. His final challenge, these kind of building to through this repetition, is but how can anyone preach unless they are sent? And I think we've understood that we need to go to be making disciples. But there's this whole concept that the whole church is able to be involved because it can't happen unless we send well. Mission is who God is. He sent Jesus into the world. Jesus sent the Spirit, and the Spirit has chosen to send us. The adventure is for all of God's people. It will look different for all of us. One body, many parts. How we're involved will be hugely varied. But resilient mission cannot be carried out by lone wolves. We will not build fruit that lasts if we're on our own, because God's heartbeat is that we do this together, that we do this in unity. This care that I'm talking about is often talked about as member care. And so I've got a definition for you from the Global Member Care Network. They say that member care is the ongoing preparation, equipping, and empowering of missionaries for effective and sustainable life, ministry, and work. It addresses human needs holistically. So we're looking at the full package of care through a wide range of activities, including friendship, encouragement, visiting, counselling, debriefing. And we're talking about caring for the whole arc of that journey, from the moment we're exploring a call to the moment that we are settling, we're thriving, and we're returning. Andy mentioned the phrase holding the rope. This is a brilliant analogy that came from William Carey and his friend Andrew Fuller, I think his name was. And William Carey is often referred to as the father of missions. He came from what is now the Baptist Mission Society. But when he was willing to go, he was frustrated that the church wasn't going, that they hadn't acknowledged their full call. And he said, I will go. But just like Moses, he said, but I won't go alone. And so together they came up with this imagery that he was willing to go down into the mines. He would go and he would rescue those that he could find down there. He'd go into the darkness, into the unknown, but he would only go if someone was holding the rope at the top. And so when we're talking about sending, it's much more than the commissioning. So we often imagine that sending is that moment where we gather together as churches, we pray for people, we maybe give them some money, we maybe eat together, we say, yay, they're going. That's brilliant, but that's not sending, that's commissioning. Sending is holding the rope, it's journeying with people. And if we can do that well, we will increase the resilience of those we send. And that's not just like a strong belief of mine, that is proved through research that the better cared for people are, the more resilient that they are. Our cross-cultural workers will face significant challenge, particularly if we're going for unreached peoples. If we look at where the unreached people groups live in the world, and then we overlay that with a map of where there is greatest persecution and terrorism, unsurprisingly, they're in the same places. The places that are still unreached are hard to go to, but they're even harder to stay in. And what we want to see is resilient workers go who will stay when others would leave. So what is resilience? We're talking about it, but what is it? It's a word that we use quite a lot. It used to be mainly used for like a rubber band, the analogy of being stretched, but being able to bounce back. UNICEF describe resilience as the ability to anticipate, withstand, and bounce back from external pressure. And Timmins says it's the ability to make the best of any situation. But sometimes the outcome and the goal should not be or will not be bouncing back. With Jesus, we have the unique possibility of post-traumatic growth, true post-traumatic growth, where we've gone through something really difficult, but because he works all things for the good of those who love him, we can find ourselves in a better place afterwards than before. And my personal favourite definition of resilience is from a man called Carr in a brilliant book called Trauma and Resilience. And he says, resilience is having the strength to fulfill the call that God has given us, even when it'll be painful and difficult. Resilience is staying fixed on a higher purpose, motivated by our love of God, our neighbour, and the world, and to be supported by friends. While others will let us down, we are carried by the one who called us. God is the ultimate carer. He's the one who sends and he's the one who provides the care, but we have the privilege of partnering with him. Resilience is not a static entity. We don't have people who we can say, oh yeah, he's a resilient person, or she actually is not very resilient. It's something, it's an active thing. It's something we can grow in. It's something we can deplete in, and it's something we can maintain. If you think back over your life, there will be seasons where you can recognize more resilience than other seasons. And one of there's an institute called the Headington Institute. They talk a lot about resilience, and they've come up with protective factors, the things that we can put in place that are positive. And then they've come up with vulnerable factors, the things that we might have been born with or part of our upbringing that make us less resilient. But they say that it's far more important that we focus on the protective factors than the vulnerable factors. And that is where care comes into place. That is where good sending comes in. Because as we are caring for others, as we're building those protective factors, their resilience will grow, and that can enable them to stay in the hard places and see the miracles that come when we partner with Jesus. Thanks, Kate. Because I'm aware of time and I'm not really going to give much time to that now either. But I would love to get to know everybody personally at some point. It's lovely to recognize lots of you. So I am going to share, um, hopefully I'm going to actually share it. I did a master's with All Nations Christian College, and my dissertation, oh, I can't make it big. Sorry. We're getting there. And my dissertation, I chose to look at an exploration of how UK churches can provide robust, effective, and tangible care to independent missionaries that they send. Obviously, this was a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of words. And I want to caveat by saying there's no way I can get through everything. And you probably wouldn't want to read everything because a lot of it's quite dull. But I've tried to get the good bits, the interesting bits, and put them into a presentation for us to look at today. So, why did I choose this topic? I said earlier, I am biblically convinced that church is the hope for the nations and that mission ideally comes from the church. I love agencies. I've worked with some really good agencies in the last couple of years, but I do believe that the commissioning came to the local church and that ideally we do this as family and we do it together. But I'm also convinced that how we send matters. Um, Dave, oh, you've just disappeared for a minute, but I'd like to, a bit of my biblical premise is from 3 John 1, verse 5 to 9. And it says, Dear friend, you are faithful in what you are doing for the brothers and sisters, even though they are strangers to you. The brothers and sisters are other believers who are working for the sake of the gospel. They have told the church about your love. Please send them in a manner that honors God. It was for the sake of the name that they went out. They received no help from the pagans. We ought therefore to show hospitality to such people so that we may work together for the truth. And this is, I was talking earlier that there's a call on all of us. And in the way that we send in a manner worthy of God or in a manner that honors Him, it's part of our worship. So our going is part of our worship and our sending is part of our worship. And we work together for the sake of His name for the truth. And so that is why I wanted to look at this topic. I am a debriefer, so I spend quite a lot of time with cross-cultural workers who are processing their journey and sharing their story. And too often, there is hurt that was needless is not quite the right word, but that was unnecessary. That had they felt more connected and more supported, they wouldn't have been quite so hurt in the process. Research shows that the most common response when asked for a sort of feeling or a state for cross-cultural workers is isolation. And I think that that is our responsibility as family, as the church family, to respond to that. I was absolutely convinced that churches have the potential and the capacity for us to send well. I still am, even post research. I still think that we can do this. And one of the reasons I wanted to do it is there's a fair amount of negative literature about the church trying to send without agency involvement. But actually, my personal experience and my friends, my co-workers, lots of people I know have been sent from New Frontiers churches to within the New Frontiers network. And there is lots of good practice that is already in place. And so I wanted to highlight that and explore that and see, is it tangible? Are people feeling it? But also I wanted to identify areas for improvement. And ultimately, I wanted to demonstrate the achievability and the imperative of church-based member care. How did I do my research? And this is a really long chapter that I've skipped over for you. But ultimately, I read loads. I read absolutely everything I could find on the topic. So if you want book recommendations, I can help you out. And I settled on using a framework from Dodds and Dodds, and it's called the Spare O framework. It's categories of care. I'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute. And then I interviewed sent ones. So I interviewed 8 people who had been sent within New Frontiers. So two of the sent ones were supported by an Anglican church, but were ministering in a New Frontiers context. One of them had been sent by a New Frontiers church, but over time that faded to nothing, and so the Anglican church stepped in to pick up the care. I did the interviews were semi-structured. They took place over Zoom. They were about 90 minutes each, to enable us to really dig deep into what care they had experienced, but also for them to testify of the tangibility of it and the impact that they had felt from the care. And each one of the interviewees identified the overseer of their care. So they looked at their sending church and said this person was responsible, or this person was the one who ensured it was happening. And then I sent a survey to the churches to try and get their perspective on what care practices they had utilised, whether they were happy with the care in each of the categories, how much time and money it had cost the church, and the what were the benefits to the church being involved. So I interviewed 8 and I surveyed 8 of the churches. So the framework is the spare O. It sounds a bit like sparrow. That's purposeful. So biblical references come into mind that his eye is on the sparrow. He won't, even if it falls to the ground, and that he provides for them. This idea that God is invested in how he cares for us, but also how we are cared for. It also is spare nothing. And this challenge that if we're going to send in a manner worthy of God, that honours him as part of our worship, we want to do it really well. We don't want to hold back our resources. We want to invest them. So these are the categories: spiritual care, physical care, actualization, which is ongoing learning and development, relational care, emotional care, and organizational care. So what did I find? I have blended in my research. I did a chapter on good practice and a chapter on better practice needed. I have blended. I don't know the past participle of blend, but I've put those together, and you will be able to spot as I do which category they fit in, whether it was good practice or better practice needed. Spiritual care was pretty strong. So 4 of the interviewees rated spiritual care as either one of the strongest or the strongest category. All of the churches reported regularly praying for their sent ones. This was noticed and valued by everyone. And everybody spoke of knowing that they were being prayed for and the difference that that made. One of the interviewees said that it instilled strength and confidence knowing that we're together in this. Commissioning. So I talked briefly about that earlier. The commissioning being that moment that we send, and the sending being the whole journey. This was an interesting one. So commissioning was mentioned by all of the surveyed churches. They all said they had done it, but only one of the interviewees mentioned it. So nobody else said, as part of our spiritual care, we were commissioned. Only one person did. I think that's a good sign that we must make sure we're doing more than just commissioning if it's not significant enough for everyone to mention. Spiritual authority, where that was happening, it was highly valued, but it wasn't a very common practice. And where it wasn't, 3 of the interviewees acknowledged A, the lack, but B, the potential benefit that there could have been through that. Again, I thought that was interesting that people were wanting challenge and correction and accountability, because sometimes we think people don't want that, but they said they did. Welcome and inclusion, so being a part of church activities when back in the UK, made a really positive impact on all of the sent ones. Zoom has changed the world. Here we are together today, and Lots of interviewees mentioned that that had enabled them to be more connected even while they were away, more so during COVID than generally, but that it had opened some doors. Prophetic encouragement was mentioned as being instrumental in confirming the call, and was encouraging and affirming throughout the journey. And spiritual formation. None of the surveyed churches reported training in biblical studies or spiritual disciplines. They instead relied upon the kind of historic grounding of teaching over the years in the church. Um, Establishing a solid theological foundation and the ability to dig deep and feed yourself it was really helpful preparation. Um, Within spiritual formation, there was no facilitating of developing specific theologies. And it's a really helpful thing if we can have helped people think through before they encounter things where they might uh, where they might hang things on a framework. So a theology of suffering, for example, if we're not helping facilitate that until people are wrestling with the level of suffering they're seeing, we're leaving them in a vulnerable position. Um, One of the things that came through regularly was churches saying things like, we did all they asked for. So we gave them everything that they had wanted. I'd like to flag at this point that from personal experience and working with lots of others, we don't know what we need until we need it. And things like spiritual formation and developing a theology of suffering, I set out when I was 18 years old. I'd never thought of anything like this. And then I was working in a rape crisis centre, and suddenly I've got to deal with the injustice of what's going on and where do I put that in my theology? We need to get out in front and put in preventative care practices rather than waiting for curative. Sharing resources was not a common practice, but again, it's a really easy way to strengthen spiritual growth. Lots of cross-cultural workers will be in places where you can't find much Christian content. Certainly, it's not like we're passing around books on a Sunday morning. And if we can establish a safe way to do this, that's a really helpful thing to do. We do need to check that how we're sending things is wise and we're not putting people in danger by doing it. So next category, physical care is this is finance and physical and mental well-being. So 5 of the interviewees voted physical as one of the strongest or the strongest category, but because of the finance and the gifts. Monthly support was flagged by everybody who had received it as being really helpful. One reflected that the consistency of knowing it was taken care of every month, it wasn't wavering, that enabled her to focus on what she actually was called to. She wasn't trying to fundraise or constantly thinking about things. She just knew that that was in place. And championing financial needs before the church was common practice and really encouraging that sense that everybody's with us in this, we're not alone. And then above and beyond that, 2 of the interviewees talked about their needs having been championed outside of the congregation. So the church leaders approaching the sphere on their behalf, or approaching where they're working together, the churches together in the city, going and saying, we've got people who are doing this, could you think about partnering with them? And that they both were hugely encouraged by that. And they reflected that it was a sense not only of we're in it together, but that if I have a problem, it's not my problem alone. The church are finding solutions for me. Financial support on re-entry was another really interesting one for me. So 4 of the interviewed sent ones mentioned how thankful they were for the ongoing support, and it ranged from 3 to 6 months after landing back in the UK. And only one church said that they'd done it. So 4 of the sent ones were really thankful for it, but only one church acknowledged that that was a practice they'd put in place. I wonder whether that means it wasn't a proactive policy. It wasn't something it was Well, maybe they just didn't know they were keeping giving them money. But certainly it points to the fact that it was really valuable for the sent ones, but the churches hadn't maybe thought it through. Provision overall was a huge blessing. One of the challenges around finance was discussions. That we're not necessarily very good about talking about money generally, but particularly in this context, that monthly amount had been agreed, and then often it wasn't increased. But obviously, inflation is a global thing, it happens everywhere. And even worse, in a couple of occasions, it was decreased with little to no notice. Um, None of the churches could specify the budget percentage for missionary support. So they gave guesses, 2 to 10% of gross tithes and offerings. But again, it wasn't affirmed, it was a fluid, organic situation. Um, in health, physical and mental well-being, there was a significant oversight. And that's not something that people have really thought through. Only 3 of the churches knew if their missionaries had health insurance or not, and none of them ensured professional involvement in their physical, psychological, or emotional health. Likewise, there was a clear gap in support for budgeting, help, and financial advice. Two of the interviewees who are now back in the UK have ongoing financial challenges that would have been prevented with better advice. So they both found themselves in a position that has a challenge for them. Hosting, when in the UK, physically caring for the missionaries. This was a beautiful demonstration of love and care for the sent ones. Lots of them didn't need it because they stayed with family when they were back in the UK, biological family, not church family. But everyone said where there had been an offer, they really appreciated it. And where there wasn't, said they would have really appreciated it. There were a couple of lovely examples of going above and beyond. So things like organising car seats for the kids, not just doing house and car, but thinking, oh, how will they move the children? Let's make sure that's in place, filling the fridge, having welcome hampers, all sorts of lovely things. And they were highly significant to the sent ones. Actualization, this is probably the weakest category. So 6 of the interviewees voted for it as the weakest or one of the weakest, but one voted for it as the strongest. Now, my intention was not to do an advertisement for the Unreached Network, but the difference was the Unreached Network. So the churches who hadn't been connected with Unreached all reported that on reflection, they were not happy with the care that they had been able to provide. 2 of the sent ones had been previously sent with agencies, and they both reflected that they'd had far more training from the agency than they had from within the church, and that there is work for us to be doing in that. But those who had had even basic training in cross-cultural relational skills felt far more equipped. And I think for me, one of the saddest moments in unpacking this was one of the interviewees said, looking back, they weren't actually sure that they had done what they'd gone for. They weren't sure that they had achieved what they'd been called there for, and that was largely because they felt totally ill prepared. And she reflected that had there been skills assessment and training, that could have significantly impacted her confidence and also her effectiveness. But one of the interviewees who had been connected with the Unreached, so used the pipeline, had done the broadcast training and had some mentoring, they voted for actualization as one of the strongest categories. His wording was that it was the standard. The last point here, learning in the sending church, came about through the interviews. I wasn't expecting it. But one of the things that was beautiful was one of the sent couples reflected on how much they'd appreciated the church acknowledging that they didn't have all the answers and they wanted to learn with them. So they had sent this couple out, and then the nations were arriving in their church. And so they turned to this couple and said, what have you learned that you can share with us? And that gave them a real sense of belonging. But they also said, we want to know how hard this is really for you. We want to learn what this looks like, what the challenges are. And so on a visit, they had given themselves to language learning for a few days just to experience it and know what it was like. On the flip side, one of the sent ones recognized that in re-entry it was really difficult, and he hadn't thought that about how hard it would be, and he wasn't prepared for it, but neither were the church, and that nobody in the church had considered that re-entry would be difficult. And so the reality that if churches are willing to learn, we can be of far greater service to the sent ones and therefore to mission. Relational care. So this was considered by most to be the primary mode of care. And I've reflected as I've been preparing this for this afternoon, that I think it's the gateway for all care, that as we build relationship, we're laying a foundation for all of the other things to come. The church remembering, championing the sent ones before the church, encouraging communication, encouraging prayer was a really positive practice where it was in place. One couple, when they visited, people they'd never met before knew who they were, and they said that was so significant for them because it was proof that the church was talking about them, praying for them when they weren't there. Relational care does wane over time. So it was much better in the beginning, and it was waning, and that was really painful for a lot of the interviewees. They were okay, they'd coped with it, but they were sad. So the challenge is how do we keep that a priority? Regular time with the church leader was reported as being highly valued by 4 of the sent ones, and 2 of them selected this as their best care practice overall that they'd received. One reflected that his monthly calls were really valuable because it enabled the leader to be involved and to speak into situations when things were difficult, because he journeyed with him and knew what was going on. And the depth of relationship that was built through that consistency meant emotional honesty was much easier. Visits, we've heard from people already how helpful visits are. That was reflected in the research. People really valued the sense that we're in this together, the sacrifice of going and being able to see. Care teams, so where actual teams have been appointed, it's declared that this is your care team, was a real source of strength and encouragement where it was in place. Newsletter response, it's really basic. But one of the things that nearly everybody mentioned was how difficult they find the lack of response to their newsletters, that they put in a lot of work and they send it out to feel connected and to keep people with them. And a lot of the time you send it to 100 people and you get 3 responses. And I think that's a really easy thing that we could change. And it doesn't take much. People reflected, it's just a couple of lines, but when it comes, it's really encouraging. And relational care, when back in the UK, was really valued by everybody. There was an acknowledgement that sometimes it's a bit much. So it's that balance, we can't see literally everybody in the church when we're back. So finding that balance. The depth of relationship and the length of relationship seemed to highly influence value. So churches tended to be more invested and provide better care for people who had been in the church a long time, people they knew a long time before they set out. Our relational care is often fluid and organic, and that the challenge is that can lead to overlooking responsibilities. So partnering that genuine organic depth of relationship with some proactivity and scheduling could be really helpful. Okay, we've got 2 more categories to go. I'm flying. Thank you for staying with me. Emotional care. This one divided the pack. So 1 voted for this as the strongest, 2 as the weakest. Emotional support is deeper than relational care. It's finding out what's really going on, the depths of your soul, in your heart. How are you really processing what's going on here? Creating a safe space. This doesn't happen quickly. We can't phone someone once and expect that we're going to have this. It requires time to build trust. This was a real challenge, often in transition. So where people had built deeply with somebody, if that link person moved churches and no longer was their link, they were left in quite a vulnerable place. So ideally, we need to be building deep relationships with more than one person so that there can be that continuity. Emotional support from leaders was highly valued. So five of the sent ones said how helpful this had been for them. Professional support, there wasn't very much of, and that was rarely accessed, facilitated, or recommended. Where it was, everyone talked about how helpful it had been, but we don't turn to that very often. So one of the interviewees had been recommended to do pre-departure counselling, deal with some of that stuff before you put yourself in an even more stressful environment, which he had found really, really helpful. One was provided with a retreat. So the church organised and paid for a retreat. And three of the sent ones had debriefs, which were referred to as transformational, but they were all self-initiated. So the churches hadn't said, let's, can we do this? I'll pay for it for you. But that would be a really easy way to pair. Last one, organizational. Again, across the board, this was pretty weak. So it was voted by five as one of the weakest care categories. And four of the churches said actually they hadn't provided any care in this category, mostly because they'd never thought about it, didn't know that was something we should be doing. Safety and evacuation plans, only two of the sent ones had these in place. And one of those two had to evacuate and said on reflection, it was nowhere near enough. There was quite a lot that had been lacking. Ethical codes, grievance procedures. This isn't really how we're functioning currently, and that would be something that agencies do have in place, but not really how we're functioning in our sending. Maybe it's an area we could grow in. Um, Cultural guidance on re-entry. So we were good at recognizing that when people went out, they needed guidance and help working out how you go on, how much things cost, where you can buy them. But on re-entry, there was very little of that. But the reality is if people have been away 15, 20 years, they don't know how to go on anymore. It's like they are an alien in their home culture. This is particularly important for teenagers. That didn't come out in my research, but it does come out often. Um, Logistical assistance, that's the practicalities, a really practical way to show love and to assist. One couple had fantastic examples. So the church had just been brilliant with them. They had sold their car for them once they left so they could keep it until the day of leaving. That people had stored boxes for them, and they'd cleaned the house so they left it in an absolute state and just got on the plane and went, and the church came and sorted everything, and they provided an address for them so they could have their post sent. Yeah, it was really, and they described that as keeping them buoyant in that season, particularly in preparing to go. It can be so stressful. So if there are people working alongside with you, it can keep you buoyant. Families were often where this care was being fulfilled. But obviously, that's not always going to be the case. And I think one of the things somebody reflected that normally the other people they've sent, their families took care of this. But for this individual, that wasn't the case. Their families weren't involved. And we are a family. Church is a family, so we could step in and take some of this. Again, MOUs, there weren't many in practice. Where there was a link with the unreached, there were MOUs, and both reflected how helpful they were. Somebody reflected that the MOU enabled everybody involved to know where they stand, and that it meant there was less opportunity for undue offence, because you knew what people had signed up for. But it also meant it was easier to ask for help because you'd already talked about it. Annual reviews, again, there was very little of this, but where there was, one of the sent ones had to write a report every year. And she said, although it was really onerous, she was really thankful she had to do it because it gave her the opportunity to take the time out to see what has God actually been doing in the last year and where do I need to focus my attention moving forward. Okay. Well done, everybody. We got through all of those categories. So these are whistle stop recommendations. The first one is fill the gaps. So that I think is fairly obvious, but where there are gaps, we can fill them, and we can start with the one that's most stood out to you. So if there's something that as you were listening, you thought, I could do that, great, go for it. And then some more cultural shifts are this idea Andy started us with this morning, that keep mission central. So there's a guy called Steve Bairn who has written quite a lot about this, and he talks about the fact that normally church life is like a pie, and everything is a slice of the pie. So you've got children's work and youth work and ladies' Bible study and outreach programs and whatever else is in your pie, and then global mission is one slice. But his challenge is actually it's much better if we put global mission in the hub, like a bicycle wheel, and the spokes come in and out of that hub, and so it's influencing everything and everything's feeding into it. um Accepting and acknowledging that care is the responsibility of the local church. If, as the local church, we are sending and saying we're with you and we send you, then there is a reality that we need to carry that. We don't need to do it all. And that's what I want to be clear on. It's our responsibility to make sure it's happening, but it's not our responsibility to provide it. So we shouldn't be trying to reinvent the wheel, but we do need to make sure that the wheel is in place. And releasing the whole church. That's my passion, that we get everybody caught up in this. And a really helpful recommendation that I've come across is the idea of a gift inventory. So looking at, okay, God's given us these people and called them away. Who has He provided to care for them? Because God ultimately is the ultimate carer. He's the one who most wants this done well, so He will provide the people. And to look in the church, first of all, who have we got who's great relationally? Who have we got who can do that deeper listening? Who have we got who can send a book once every few months? Who have we got who will ask the awkward questions? Who can clean their house? And it's a way of releasing all of the gifts in the church, but also to look wider. Who is available in our network? Who's done this before? We might not have any cross-cultural experience in the local church, but within the network, we can speak to so-and-so, or we can contact the Unreached network and we can include them. We can send agents for agency training if we don't feel equipped to do it, but to release that and look at who has God already provided. Small groups as care teams, they're already meeting. So we're not creating a new program and trying to get people to come along to it, but to ask a small group to adopt a sent one, and that they pray for them every single week, and that we ask that small group to contact that sent one once a month. They can decide how they do it, whether that somebody contacts them every month or whether that moves around different people, different families in the group. But as Hannah talked about, the value of having an advocate, having someone who will speak on your behalf, someone who talks to you and hears how difficult it is and comes back to the church and says, we really need to pray for Susie this morning. And then finally, the proactive and structured approach. It's really helpful to use scheduling. People have mentioned that a bit, but like in any relationship, we do need to put discipline in. We need to make sure that we're spending time together, and that's how we will ensure that we maintain care over a prolonged period of time. We're never going to bump into them in Tesco's. They're not going to come up to us on a Saturday morning at the park. So how can we remind ourselves? Do we need to put a photo of them above our desk, or do we need to put an alarm in our phone? But how can we build that in? And other proactive and structured things like MOUs, annual reviews, care checks, all of those things can be a real blessing to how we send. Okay, my time is definitely gone, so I will stop. But I do want to acknowledge this was a whistle-stop tour. I threw so much at you, but hopefully, even if there was a couple of things that you could take away, that would be helpful. There was loads that came out of my research that we didn't even go anywhere near. So there are topics like crisis care, risk management, care for teams, not just individuals. How do we how do we shift our care in different seasons? So there's so much, but I had 30 minutes. So
That's fantastic, Laura.